afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Teaching and Learning TV. Teaching and Learning TV is an initiative of the University of KwaZulu-Natal's annual Teaching and Learning Conference. And the purpose of these panels is to expand discussions on the most pertinent themes that are emerging from the mainstream conference. So it's really to engage in further discussion from our keynote addresses. And today we are very privileged to have with us Professor Narend Baijnath, who just delivered a keynote address at the conference, looking at technology, looking at ideas about reimagining higher education policy for the 21st century. Professor Baijnath is the CEO designate for the Council for Higher Education, the CHE, and I'm going to ask him to say a little bit more about himself just now, but let me also introduce you to the other members of this distinguished panel that we have who are going to have conversation today. We have Dr. Carol Bertram from the School of Education at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Professor Murthy Maistry, also from the School of Education, and Professor Julia Priest. Professor Baijnath, it is a real pleasure to have you with us, and thank you for your time. You are the CEO designate of the Council on Higher Education, about to start this new job on the 1st of October 2015. So please, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Well, thank you very much, Sarojini. I'm delighted to be here and to be given this opportunity. I am currently the Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University of South Africa. I've been at the University of South Africa since the merger in 2004. Before that, I was DVC at Technikon SA and also Dean of Community Sciences at that institution. So I've had several roles, aside from being Dean, DVC Planning and Development, DVC for Research and Planning, Vice Principal for Strategy Planning and Partnerships at UNISA. So it's diverse roles that's given me a good understanding of higher education challenges from multiple perspectives. And I believe that it's helped prepare me for this current role in the CHE.
Great.
Thank you.
It's lovely to have you with us, and I'm sure we'll learn a little bit more from your expertise. Carol, would you like to say a little bit more about yourself and your interests and what it is you do?
Thanks. I teach mostly on the postgraduate program within the Teacher Education Studies discipline at the School of Education in Pietermaritzburg. That means most of our students are working teachers, so they're coming part-time to do their honours, masters or PhD studies. So the challenge is to work with people who are working full-time and also trying to complete their postgraduate degrees. And my own interest is around issues of knowledge, of curriculum, of professional learning for teachers.
Great. So you must have had quite an interest in the whole idea of online learning, etc. So we can have some more discussion about that. Yeah. Professor Maistry.
Thank you very much. I have a particular interest in higher education pedagogy and curriculum as it relates to the teaching of commercial subjects, that's economics, accounting, business, auditing. I've been trusted leader and head of school, former head of school for 5 years. And I also have an interest in the new managerialism that seems to be operating at universities, and now how human resource department seems to be taking over the management of the work of an academic, and how this new performance discourses starts to shape the work of academics in particular ways. So that's my interest.
And another very hot topic emanating from your keynote lecture, Professor Baijnath, so I'm sure we're going to be having lots of interesting discussion. Professor Priest.
Okay, thank you very much. My background is in adult and community education, and I teach a number of postgraduate students. But I also have a strong interest in the notion of lifelong learning and the public good role in higher education, particularly its third mission of community engagement. And I think what I would like to explore further from your presentation and in relation to the kind of discussions that have happened in the conference generally are perhaps the fact that the notion of technology perhaps addresses the two pillars of life of of lifelong learning, which are learning to do and learning to know. But I'm interested in how we can address the pillars of learning to be and learning to live together, which are more relevant to the community engagement mission of universities.
Thank you. Thank you, Julia. I think we have lots to discuss. And when you introduced your work on the Council on Higher Education, Professor Baijnath, you said there were three main areas that the Council focuses on, the one being quality and bringing under constant scrutiny how we understand quality in higher education, to provide policy guidance to higher education institutions, and of course the third, to foster a discourse of higher education. And I think that, just hearing from the kinds of things that you picked up and the kinds of questions that came up, we could start at any one particular place. I'm going to give you the opportunity to decide which one of those you would like to begin with first, and then we'll see how the conversation goes.
Well, thank you very much. I think that one of the biggest challenges we confront at the systemic level is that we have large numbers of students coming in from very diverse backgrounds, and their learning needs are not being met within higher education. So many of them drop out or stop out or fail to make progress in their studies. Where those students who do make it or reach a semblance of success, it's to great difficulty because there are linguistic challenges. They might have had a poor learning experience at school that not prepared them properly for the rigors and demands of university. And all of that culminates in very high failure rates and very high dropout rates. And I think that given the cost to the fiscus as a developing country, we cannot let that carry on. And one of the major tasks of the Council on Higher Education is to ensure that the teaching and learning experience within our universities is commensurate with the diversity of our students, that we meet their learning needs, that we give due attention to mediating learning so that students can succeed and reach their full potential. And I think that that's happening in a very, in quite a variable way across the sector. And mindful of that, there's a quality enhancement project at the moment that's focused primarily on teaching and learning.
Well, I do believe that this panel here is committed to precisely that, right? To this, and there has to be a sort of social justice commitment in order to address that. But I think what I heard Carol and Murthy suggest, and perhaps you want to expand on that, is that this new managerialism might be compromising that very effort and that commitment. And so perhaps you wanted to say something more about that?
I think there's a tension in the work of the higher education academic and even in higher education. And that is that there's this assumption that this increased accountability, performance, and this performative discourse and this new managerialism is going to automatically translate into better teaching. And you did mention that from your own experience that people learn to finesse this, and those were your words, and they produce the right kinds of evidence to develop this magnificent teaching portfolio. But the actual quality of what's going on in their classrooms is questionable. So maybe the question then is, how do we manage this tension of having this very regimental kind of performance contract that we have to sign up with the university, and ensuring that the real quality happens in the classroom? But at the moment, we seem to have swung heavily in favor of the human resource. Very, very, very regimental accountability performance, and by the end of a particular period, you're given a score of between 1 and 4, and that score sticks with you for the whole year. It has certain implications for how academics construct themselves, how the university constructs the academic. And I've written a piece on this, and I use Foucauldian analysis of discipline and punish. It's about this constant surveillance that the university academic is under, and you get assessed every 6 months. It creates a kind of schizophrenia. You've got to be this excellent academic researcher in your discipline and in your teaching. So if you're a chemist, you've got to be a master chemist, as well as a master, or how to teach it.
But Professor Baijnath, you did say in the main session, in response to Carol's question, that actually this has been imported from the corporate world, and so I suppose the question then is, if it's here and it's here to stay, what is the role of the council perhaps in making it more adaptable to higher education, because it clearly isn't at the moment? Or, as Carol was asking, do we need it at all? And Carol, maybe you want to say something before Professor Baijnath, of whether we actually do need
Yeah, I
it.
mean, I think you kind of alluded to that fact that most academics are in the field not to earn money and are there because they have a deep connection and commitment to the students and to the discipline. And I think for me what performance management does, it undermines that assumption that academics are in the field to provide the best quality that they can. What it assumes is that they're not there to do that, and therefore we must, you must account and we must put you under surveillance. And I think it's that kind of thing that has created within academia, certainly we see it within our own institution, I think, a tension between the work that academics really want to do and the kind of work that they feel they have to show that they can be measured
to tick the box
in these kinds of things. And I really would say, I think you mentioned in your keynote as well, we must find a way of distinguishing between those who are superlative and those who are not. And I kind of ask myself, why? Why must we do that? Generally, that is the role of promotions. That if you are just an average person, then you can still deliver really good, teaching to your students, but you may remain a senior lecturer or a lecturer, perhaps. And generally, is it not the promotion, the route then of promotions to say you're superlative? I don't understand why that must be something that then happens every 6 months.
And how that relates to better teaching, but perhaps you want to respond.
Well, I think that measurement and evaluation is very much part of the landscape of higher education.
Internationally.
Yes. We do it routinely with our students, often unquestioningly. So we shouldn't be too resistant to coming under scrutiny ourselves, I believe. It's a fact that the scenario that you describe, clearly there are academics and scholars who are motivated in that way, but not all. So part of the impetus behind greater performance management is to ensure that for the vast amounts of resources from the public purse that we put into higher education, that there has to be a return on that investment. There has to be demonstrable value. And at many of our institutions, that value is not demonstrated. Because if it was working as well as we imagine, consistently across the system, we wouldn't have the huge dropout rates and the huge failure rate that we have. We wouldn't have so many dreams deferred and aspirations not fulfilled. So I'm skeptical myself about the way in which performance management is applied, but I do believe that there's a place for it. And as I've argued in the main session, what we need to do is to develop instruments and processes within higher education, led by academics, that we are comfortable with. It says that that's a crude, if we are importing something from the corporate sector that's crude and simplistic, then we must demonstrate that, and through our capabilities as scholars, we can do that very easily, and say, here's a more sophisticated way of evaluating someone's performance and distinguishing qualitatively between one and another.
Yes, but Julia, I'm going to come back to you, Murthy, but you were talking about the difference between doing and being. And in a sense, performance management can never really measure being, can it? It can't. There's some things that can't be measured, and there's some people, I think the underlying idea perhaps of performance management is if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. Right?
Yes, I think that's certainly a concern, that accountability is measured on the basis of criteria that identify what the accountability is, and that's inevitably a reductionist approach. And the whole point of universities is about being innovative and being responsive to change and making things happen. Whereas if we're being measured on what we've done and it's defined and counted, it does run contrary to the notion of what higher education is about. And while clearly that system is here to stay, there needs to be a way of understanding how we measure the learning to be and the learning to live together, particularly in the context of South Africa and Africa generally. And to borrow a system that has been developed in the West is always a bit worrying for this part of the world.
Yeah, I want to sort of pick up on that point, and also pick up on the point that you made as well, and that we can't wait for this. The CHE is not going to develop this for us.
Oh.
That we've got to respond as an institution, as academics. We've got to own the space. There's a feeling that the neoliberal trap has been set already. This whole performance discourse is here to stay, and we can't escape this thing. But we've got to find ways in which we challenge what's there. Okay? And if we can infuse a formative element to it, that beyond simply measuring, that there's got to be a formative aspect, a developmental aspect that supports the academic as the academic grows through and becomes competent and accomplished, like you were describing earlier.
But isn't that a part of the whole point about developing a discourse on higher education? I remember a Senate meeting once where you used the word neoliberal, and you were asked by a very senior person in management, could you please define neoliberal at Senate? And I think if we don't have a discourse around these kinds of issues, it's difficult to develop policy when we're not even engaging on the same terms. We're not recognizing the differentiation in the kinds of work that we do, in our disciplinary differences and our ontological differences, etc. But I do want to come to the question about, because I think we could debate the issue of performance management for much longer, but I do want to come to the issue of technological advances for teaching and learning, because that was one of the topics that came up in your keynote as well, and the three L's that you brought up: learning skills, literacy skills, and life skills. And I was particularly interested in how technological advances link up with the learning skills: critical thinking, creative thinking, collaborative and community thinking. How do we bring these two things together, the technology and these things which largely cognitively developed? I don't know if I'm making sense, but or if you understand my question.
Well, let me see if I do. What I was trying to signal is that the world of work is changing, and even the world of higher education is changing. Technology has made possible a whole lot of work that is much simpler, that you can access huge repositories of information, that you can search for information, get answers to any question really that you can think of and formulate, you can get an answer to. So whether it's within the workplace or within higher education, that can be done. Now, traditionally, as I was arguing, in higher education, we have set ourselves up as the founts of knowledge and as the repositories of valid knowledge, and that is all changing. So going into the workplace, or even going into students coming into higher education, the higher education institution is not the primary and only repository of knowledge, or the only place where knowledge is created and preserved. That is what is one of the most important changes. The other point is that there's just so much of information, so much of knowledge, so much of content, so much of data available freely and openly, that to navigate that world is so much more complex. And if we are giving, we expose our students in a learning program to a very limited amount of content, and they're only required to navigate and understand that and formulate understandings from that. When they go into the real world, it's vastly different. They're dealing with huge amounts of data, huge amounts of knowledge, and the skills which are required to navigate that world are far more complex than we may be teaching them. That's what I was arguing, that we need to look at, in this very, very different world that they're going into in the digital world, what kinds of skills and capabilities do they need that will equip them for that world?
So in a sense, it's about actually the limitations of technology, because while technology can help you find the answers, doesn't necessarily help you to develop the skill to learn how to question. And in a sense, that's what higher education is about. And I think, Julia, for your work in community engagement, especially, and the buzzword of indigenous knowledge systems, etc., that's the kind of work. It's about the questioning, the deeper learning, isn't it? Do you want to say?
Yes, I think certainly the world of work is about getting students to experience life outside academia, and so the role of the university as a public good and its interaction with the wider community, whether it's business or just the wider community outside of the university, the responsibility to create community engagement possibilities, I think, would be something that it addresses the curriculum. It doesn't address IT specifically, but if the problem that employers find is that students aren't yet able to engage with the world of work, then we have a responsibility to create a curriculum that enables those students to engage with the world of work. And a values curriculum, a responsibility curriculum, all those kind of things then come into play. And it's finding out how we can incorporate that into their everyday degree programs. And I think it's quite interesting that the Durban University of Technology, the Vice-Chancellor has insisted that 30% of all undergraduate curriculum has a values-based element, a kind of life skills element. And I think it's something that I don't know that our university does it, but or even many universities do it. But how can we make that link with the world of work? Maybe consulting with the world of work a bit more than we do. Whether there is an opportunity on Senate or Council to have that conversation so that we actually change how we interact with the outside world.
Murthy, you want to say something?
Pick up on the point.
Yes.
Martha Nussbaum writes quite eloquently about, there's a book, it's called Education Not for Profit.
Yes.
why we need the humanities and the social sciences, and to introduce the human element into education. And she doesn't discount the fact that there's a need for economic growth, but as soon as education is seen as serving the needs exclusively of the economy, then we run into trouble and we turn out individuals that lack certain kinds of skills, human skills, the ability to feel for fellow human beings.
Right. And Gayatri Spivak too, in anesthetic education, right? That's her idea. But like performance management, technology too is here to stay, and technology assists us. And while we might recognize its limitations, the question is how to infuse that. Carol, in your own work with the curriculum, have you found new innovations in the technology side? Are you?
No, I mean in my own work, because all of my students are probably 30 plus.
Right.
They're not. Most of them are not actually
techno savvy.
Techno savvy. I mean, some of them are, but most are still struggling. And I think, as a university, we could go a lot further to really help them to engage with it. So I think the diversity. We've got maybe an undergraduate cohort that comes in and are maybe so-called digital natives. But then there's also a lot of lifelong learners who come in at various points of their lives that are not that at all. So I think we've got this diverse system where you can't assume that everybody, just if you give them a device, the kind of physical access to a device is not necessarily knowing, the kind of epistemological access to it. And I think my biggest issue around, I think technology can do a huge amount, and it must, but we must never ever confuse access to information with education. Having access to information and to Google, we kind of say, oh, you can Google anything. You can find the answer to anything. At one level, yes, you can. But at the other level, it's only really a higher education that is, well, hopefully also it should be a secondary, that can give you access to conceptual frameworks that help you understand what those things mean. Right. Otherwise, you can read anything on the internet and believe it. And that is actually hugely dangerous. If students are not really getting with it a conceptual framework to help them understand and work with that knowledge and distinguish between it, evaluate it. So I think if we just get, if we're just at the point of saying, yes, we need access to information, that's not what we need.
And I suppose in South Africa, it's hard to avoid the ways in which the question of access is so intricately tied with race and our past, etc. But I think the issue of epistemological access is one that we need to be addressing in this discussion as well. And this discussion, which I'm afraid to say is far too short because we've run out of time. So I'm going to ask each of you to give us a minute or so of just parting shots. What would you like? Let's start with Professor Baijnath.
Thanks very much. I think to argue for something is not to argue against something else necessarily. So I think it's very important that what I'm advocating for is understood in that way. What I'm seeing, and I think that what many of us are seeing, are the major challenges and the policy aspirations that we have is to widen access, to increase access, widen participation, give more and more students a quality higher education. I think that's a national goal. I'm saying that to reach large numbers of students, it is possible to do so and to use the affordances of technology to do that. But it doesn't mean that for arguing for that, or by arguing for that we're arguing against the traditional values and aspirations of higher education for the high order skills and capabilities. At the same time, I'm not arguing that the technology is a panacea for all of these challenges. We mustn't be seduced by the hype. We must see the possibilities and leverage them. That's what I'm arguing. But by the same token, we must not be seduced by the hype, because many people are purveying technology and have been for decades as a solution to all of the problems of access and so on. And ultimately, it will replace the speaking teacher and so on. Of course, that's all nonsense. There will always be a need for a skilled mediator of learning. As a standing teacher or someone doing that, I'm arguing that it is possible to reach far larger numbers in a more sophisticated way, in simpler ways, and enrich the experience of students using technologies. I'm not saying, in fact, the need for skillful teaching will be greater rather than less.
Thank you. I think there's a real wisdom in that, and certainly it would allay the fears of the early career academic who asked you the question in the keynote lecture about whether he's in the right career or not. So thank you for that, and thank you for that wisdom. Carol?
I think that's absolutely right, and I'd like to agree that I think as academics we do need to think about what technology can do for us and how we can use it more wisely. I think South African higher education is an exciting place to be because there is still such a hunger. I mean, I was just thinking it's very different from how Professor Tierney is kind of was talking about earlier today about the need to try and get people to want to go to college. And I kind of thought, well, that's the last of our problems. I mean, everybody in South Africa wants to go to university. Our problem is, of course, as you say, how do you massify and still create the kind of quality? So I think we really need to build on that enthusiasm and motivation that people still have, that they still have this belief that a higher education can do something for them, which I think is maybe not the case in other countries, and we do really need to build on that. But I think, just as a little warning, maybe for universities or for the CHE, I'm not sure, but academics cannot be expected to do more and more and more with less and less and less. And I think at some point there might well be a breaking point there, you know, so that I think in every university, as you massify, you know, the number of students has doubled, but the number of staff has not, and the resources have not. And students are also, you know, they don't want to queue for 3 hours to get into the lab to use a computer. Is that what they signed up for? So we really need to think very carefully about how much we can massify without a concomitant response in resources. And I think to say, well, we must make do, it kind of is not quite, that's not good enough, I think.
Well, thank you, Carol. I think important to remember the creative tension between massification and quality and how to negotiate that. So thank you very much. Murthy, some parting words from you.
Thank you very much. I think I want to be optimistic. I think we're living in exciting times. This is an exciting moment. And for the first time, real debates about what constitutes quality in higher education in the new South Africa, given that quality seems to be implicated with a whole lot of racial undertones about transformation and employment equity. And we didn't have time to get into all of those issues.
Roads must fall, yes.
To have the new head of the Council on Higher Education debate this with us, you know, as a start of a conversation. So I think it's exciting times for us.
It's been a privilege, hasn't it? Yes. So thank you. Julia?
Okay, well, thank you. Yes, well, to be on a positive note as well, I think the introduction of technology into African contexts provides Africa for the first time with an opportunity to give itself a level playing field in terms of knowledge production with the rest of the world. And it can leapfrog over a number of other resources that have hindered it in the past. But I think also I would have a word of caution in that South Africa is part of a much wider continent, and the rest of Africa doesn't have the resources that South Africa has. And if we are encouraging international students into our arena, then we have to also be aware that those technologies aren't available in a wider sphere. And whatever teaching resources we do develop, we have to be conscious that most of those African students aren't necessarily going to be able to even access, let alone understand, some of the technologies that we have. And our teaching strategies, distance learning or whatever, have to take account of all those different mechanisms that are available.
Well, that's a really hot debate, I think, about technology, especially about access to technology, because I think, especially in the townships, I don't think access to technology is a problem at all if you look at cell phones and those kinds of developments. But that's certainly a conversation to be had. It's lovely that we've all ended on quite positive notes, I think, and it reminds me of, I saw a definition the other day of bureaucracy or technocracy, I think it was. It said technocrats are too busy. They can't see whether a glass is half full or half empty, because they're too worried about whether there's a coaster underneath it or not. But anyway, I'd love to thank all of you for your time, especially Professor Baijnath. Thank you. I know you're very busy and you have to head out now, but thank you very much for your time, and thank you to our panelists. And we look forward to having more discussion here on Teaching and Learning TV. Thank you.